Welcome, fifth graders, to day 3. Give me a second to get the PowerPoint going. Here we go. And day 3 of Inferential Thinking. Yesterday we worked with a work of fiction talking about Long John Silver and an excerpt from Treasure Island. And today we're going to look at the nonfiction side of things. But our learning targets haven't changed too much. You will make inferences using what you see in pictures and read in text. You will use evidence in the text to make inferences. You will visualize to understand the text, and then use academic sentence frames to discuss strategies. Now, going back to that definition where we started with at the beginning of this process, inferential thinking is adding up clues within the text with personal knowledge to understand what is not being said. So we're taking what we're reading, we're taking what we already know, we're going to jumble those together to come up with an inference. Now, one of the things that good readers are constantly doing, and what good readers do, is that they know how to make inferences, and they make inferences all the time when reading fiction and nonfiction texts. Yesterday we worked with fiction. The day before we worked with just looking at visualizing, okay, and trying to piece together what those girls were thinking and why they were feeling that way. Well, now we're going to look at nonfiction. But before we get there, let's talk about our sentence frames. We start off with saying, my inference is, and then we talk the clues, or today we're going to talk more about evidence that helped me make this inference are, or is, the clue is, and visualizing something helped me make my inference. All right, so this is what we're going to be working with today, and it's titled Stars. In ancient times, stars were a mystery. People watched them form patterns and move across the night sky. Some ancient people made up stories about how the stars got in the sky. These people believed the stars were once people, gods, and goddesses. Today, astronomers study the stars and help us understand them. We now know that stars are giant balls of gas that give off light and heat. We know that stars gather in groups called galaxies, and that galaxies can hold between 10 million and 1 trillion stars. We also know how stars are formed and how they fade from the sky. Now, today you're going to practice reading and make inferences about a text. You can visualize to help you understand. So I've just read this, and what I want you to do is I want you to read it a couple of times to yourself. So you can pause the video and just sit there and read this. Read it a couple of times. And what I want you to do is I want you to locate evidence in the text that will help you make an inference. And then when you find evidence, write it in this area right here. Once you have your evidence, once you've read it, once you have your evidence, what I want you to do then is I want you to make an inference and list the inferences here. So you might have several pieces of evidence here, and you might have several inferences. And you have this sheet. What I want you to do is underline it. Underline, circle, flag, whatever you need to do that's going to mark important information to you that's either going to become evidence or is really going to help with your inference. So why don't you pause the video, take a few minutes, and get to work and try that, okay? Oops. I tried to do something here, but then something happened, and here we go. All right, now, hopefully you've taken some time and you've reread the article. You've talked about what you've looked at. You've seen some evidence that will lead you to inferences. Now, this is what I got as I read through, and actually it's kind of what I copied from the book, but don't tell anyone that I copied that. Okay? Evidence. Stars were a mystery in ancient times. Some people believe stars, that should say stars, not starts, were once people, gods, and goddesses. And I got that from right here. Now, why did I write that down? What inference did I make from that? Well, the inference I made, people in ancient times didn't have tools and instruments for studying the stars. Okay, those tools and The instruments, they came later. A lot of what, when we talk about when we talk about stars, we talk about constellations, and a lot of those came from the Greeks and the Romans as they were trying to explain what was happening around them. So we have Cassiopeia the Queen, and we have, the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper and all those things. But it was their way of trying to understand the world around them, and they made up these stories to help understand. And that's what people do when they don't understand things. So they didn't have the tools and the instruments to study the stars, so they tried to make the best way to explain them. Okay, so that's the evidence I use to create this inference. Now, there's another inference that we could also make. Okay, and that's today astronomers study the stars and find out facts about them. And the inference is just that next point after that last inference. Today, scientists have tools and instruments they can use to study the stars. So it's one of those things that in the past, they didn't have the tools, so they don't really know, so they made up things. Whereas now, we know more about the stars because we have the tools. Okay? So hopefully as you read through, you're asking yourself questions. What could you do to help make an inference? What visualizations can you make? One of the things that you could visualize is kind of, when we go back to this page, people believe stars were once people, gods and goddesses. And you can look at and you can kind of visualize the patterns of the stars. And maybe you can see Orion the hunter, or Cassiopeia the queen, or you can see, Gemini, things like that, that the people in Roman and Greek times used to explain what was happening, because they didn't know. Because why? They didn't have the tools and instruments for studying the stars. All right? So now that you've made these instruments, okay, my question for you, and unfortunately we don't have Flipgrid, otherwise I'd have you kind of open up to Flipgrid and respond to this, but what kind of texts have you read in which you've had to make inferences? Are they science texts? Are they social studies? Okay? When do you make inferences more? Do you make them more in a fiction book or a nonfiction? Okay? So these are things I want you to think about when you make it with inferences. And a big one is, why might an author of a nonfiction text want you to make inferences versus just coming out and just telling you right away? I mean, it would be a lot easier, I think, as a reader if the author would just tell us everything. I think that would, we'd be able to take much more information. But I also think we'd probably get a little bit bored with the reading if everything was told to us. So I think maybe by the author not telling us everything, it gives us and it helps our brain and it engages our brain in the reading process. All right, so that's all we have today. But one thing I want you to do is that I want you to remember that most nonfiction texts require readers to make inferences. So it doesn't just happen in fiction, it happens in nonfiction as well. And what I want you to do is I want you to try making inferences today when you read in small groups. If I have the opportunity to call you, or when you're doing your step test, or with F&P tests coming up, or anytime you're reading, I want you to try and do your best and make inferences and connect your background knowledge and things you already know and your experiences with things that the author is saying, and make those connections. All right, so our classic ending, I want to just review that inferential thinking is adding up clues within the text and combining that with your personal knowledge to understand what is not being said. It's what the author is hinting to and alluding to that a good reader really pulls out. And as a good reader, you need to know how to make inferences, and you need to be able to make those connections to what you know and your common knowledge in fiction, and what we found out today in nonfiction text. All right, thank you.